That was Eric Clapton with Lay Down Sally here on 88.1 FM WVYC, and good afternoon to you all. This is the voice of your college. My name is Keelan Tollinger, and I'm your host for the next hour. Thanks for tuning into this show on Friday, November 2nd. It's the Friday before Election Day, which I'm sure I'll cover the results of afterwards next week, very briefly. If you can find time on your Tuesday after classes to get out there and vote, maybe you've filled out an absentee ballot, best of luck in supporting the candidates you hope will do the most good. It's always a little funny to me how in this particular stretch of days you get like a whole unloading of campaign ads in, which sort of around this time it's kind of like most people have made up their minds already who their choice is, but these candidates always have to pummel the broadcast waves with one last batch of messages. And they're all positive too, typically, which is the funny thing. Like, in the last few days of the campaign, you don't want to be still attacking your opponents. You just want to put in a nice smile, hope a positive note for America's future is basically the thing that gets people on the fence over to your side. No matter what, as soon as the Tuesday's over and the choices are counted up, just remember that just about every sign on the side of the road will be taken down. There'll be no more flyers in the mail. And we don't have to sling any more insults at each other. At least be civil for about 6 months until the campaigning efforts start showing up again. Also this morning, to make things a little more complex around the campus, the Tyler Run apartment complex's power went out this morning. It was nothing affecting the rest of the campus, just the row of apartments that I live in. No lights for the morning shower, no internet. It was like living in the Stone Age again, but fortunately, at least the flashlights in our smartphones worked out. And they've been having a couple of these on West Campus actually, these power outages for no apparent reason, which was earlier in the month. For students living in Tyler Run, they've already had to deal with the washing machines not working for the better part of this week, and I don't know if the electricity outage was related for this morning, but power came back on at about noon or so, crisis averted. Other than that, remember that if you're ever curious about what past shows have covered here on In the Studio, you can go online to youtube.com and search In the Studio with Keelan Tollinger, and you will have an entire online archive of material, all my monologues without the music for your re-listening needs. I think the next show coming up on the 9th of November will be one particularly worth saving. That's because I believe I'm going to have my first guest on the show this semester. He's been in the studio with me in the past. It's Bobby Furta, one of my past co-hosts, and I'm happy to bring him back for a special edition where it's not going to be me just talking to you. Finally, we'll get some conversation in, hopefully bring in two sides. He's probably got some topics he wants to share and maybe some of his favorite tunes as well. Certainly hoping you can join us next week on the 9th and check in on what Bobby has been up to. I needed to catch up on pop culture and what's been happening in the superhero movie world especially. But what's on the line for this week? Plenty of major topics like what we're learning about the alleged Democratic mail bomber, and also of the synagogue shooter who targeted over a dozen Pittsburgh civilians. We of course never want to give these terrible individuals any more time in the spotlight, but I think there's a conversation to have about the limits of internet free speech and hate speech that, as it turns out, both of these men have tested in the last week. Across the Atlantic Ocean, a tragedy for a British soccer team occurred last weekend, if you haven't heard, plus a little bit on the way we as somewhat destructive Americans tore apart a field. It'll be about bringing America's game across the pond. And recently, the Muller probe announced that it was finished, but the other day an accusation was intended to throw the whole thing out. I'll catch you up on the implications of that, and a little bit about a debate concerning the control of the internet between federal government and local municipalities. There's a lot to cover on this hour for sure, but let's kick things off in the hour with some music though. Coming up next on WVYC, it's a song from Citizen named Jet here on 88.1 FM. I'll be back in just a few minutes with more on In the Studio. Welcome back to 88.1 FM WVYC. That was Citizen with Jet from their album As You Please. And let's go straight into the first topic of the afternoon that I want to cover, and that is most of the conclusions about the story of Cesar Sayaka over the week. The Florida man who mailed over a dozen suspicious packages rigged with a potential explosive device inside, intended to harm or frighten prominent Democrat representatives and donors. Yeah, we can safely say that, for instance, the conspiracy theory that I think was beginning to form around the end of last week that, oh, this is a Democrat just masquerading as somebody who hates the party to make all the Republicans look bad. From what it appears like so far, and authorities have been a bit tight-lipped about his motivations still, Sayaka was indeed a Trump supporter who intended to do some harm if he could to the people representing the political side that he despised. Images of the van he was living out of, for instance, plastered with these pro-Republican, anti-Democrat, anti-CNN, anti-swamp, just like the clear indication the party he was focusing on was really his target and he wanted to destabilize it in any way that he could. The footage started turning up of him at Trump rallies with his big red sign accusing politicians and the media of all sorts of things. Images of crosshairs over Hillary Clinton, for instance. We only realize after the fact of terrible stories like these when the media digs up violent tendencies, run-ins with the police, for instance, that a person is likely planning something disastrous, capable of something. It's feasible that they can hurt somebody. Only when the person is popularized do we tend to say that, yes, his immediate family and his acquaintances, somebody in society should have intervened beforehand. The most telling thing about Sayaka's motivations, I think, is, and in the future there's going to be loads upon loads of evidence pieces like this, it's his social media feeds. The anthology of tweets that, like, let's face it, if there are things that will, like, get you kicked out of an establishment or something, get reported to a superior in the workplace or the police in public, if you say them online, threaten individuals with, like, dark days in their future, I feel online messages have to be dealt the same way. The same grave implications of saying it to someone's face, basically. Like, folks take advantage of the fact that no matter where you are, I mean, you can live in Florida and throw words at a senator in California just by saying it to their Twitter account. And because that in real life, since that conversation, that relationship isn't spatially close together, like by location, it's assumed that it's not technically that serious. I think the seriousness of all these postings by politically radical, violently motivated standpoints need to be better policed. They need to hold more gravity. Because you might think that since the distance of having some of these threats to political figures occurs hundreds or thousands of miles away from each person's computer, Sayaka in this case had a way of basically reaching his targets wherever. That was traditional mail. Now we're getting to the point where a person's history on social media is being considered permanent, and the ways they think in the past are often telling about their behavior in reality. It's pulled and fired many people from their jobs. Athletes and media talents these days need to answer for what they post. But those differences are like the differences in opinion and bias that most of these cases are dealing with. Here we had violent threats and maybe some childish virtual doodles of politicians and crosshairs. But while it was from a theoretical nobody in a sense, why not still hold these faces in the crowd accountable for this hateful language? And if I sound like I'm sort of fringing on the censorship of free speech, understand that in this instance, I don't think any of it in a civil discourse belonged to stay. I mean, maybe there's a normal Sayaka tweet out there, but I'm just reacting to my major impressions of his virtual life. And to touch on about what kind of a man this was off the screen, I think an interview with his former family lawyer painted the best picture of how he thought he was living. I believe he told lots of people that he had a Native American heritage. It put him in a more diverse, unique place to say that he could be a Seminole. Not even close to the actual case. Sayaka faked the driver's license to have his birth year appear a decade older, in a sense making him look 10 years younger. For years, apparently, he was committed to bodybuilding, using steroids, being an adult entertainer. You get the idea he was a person with a very fragile self-image, like glass, but I guess also just as dangerously pointed. And after calling up the utility company that shut off the electricity to his laundromat years ago, I think threatening to rig the offices up, quote, worse than 9/11, all the pieces were in place to say that ultimately he needed a lot of help, and never sought it out for himself. His family had no influence over him. Either he had to search for some figure to tell him to change his ways to any degree, or it was for the betterment of his personal image that motivated him. And as sad as it seems to put in the words of this lawyer, Sayaka found a father figure in President Trump that I guess spoke enough hard rhetoric stood up unabashed for his beliefs about America's supposed values, and was worth listening and emulating even beyond the words. Sayaka wasn't a registered Republican, registered to vote at all until the 2016 election. You don't have to say much about these whole circumstances to acknowledge that Trump's stance on Democrats might have influenced Sayaka's ways, and I'm not going to claim they're directly caused by each other, because there was definitely the factor that mental illness and a lack of socialization and tolerance played in pushing this attempted bomber to do what he did. Anyway, it's about 3:15, so let's move on. I have the weather check just about ready here for York College of Pennsylvania. And to move on into this topic a little more, I think Twitter's role in this I'd like to quickly explore too, since that's sort of related to the next side to all of this. So the fact that Sayaka's posts were always public, people who came across them had plenty of opportunities to report these messages. And I think in one instance they were under review from the moderators at Twitter, and those oddly somehow were turned away. Meaning some of the people reporting them got these messages back from the Twitter heads saying like, after review, there's no need to take these tweets down. Here's our rules and guidelines which say no hate speech, under the the pretense that still this website wants to support free speech, but nothing inherently violent or hurtful to others. So for a while, Sayaka was slipping through the cracks and never faced any punishment or censorship that he would have rightly deserved. And yet there's grounds elsewhere on the internet where people don't even want to consider the consequences of their speech. They don't want Twitter or more rational people looking over their shoulders and disagreeing. That's where a site like Gab.com came in, which this synagogue shooter in Pittsburgh was a frequent visitor. I think if I understand it correctly, there are message boards that attract plenty of silent or vocal but extremist thought. It's these circles where Robert Bowers participated in, and even announced that one reported line, "I'm going in," hours before his anti-Semitic act, which nobody would really know if is a serious indication of what's going to happen and where until it happened. In this website, there's dozens and dozens of people apparently with these fears and unfounded claims like Jewish worshippers are going to slowly eradicate other people. It's a domain where these ideas get passed around like everyday conversation. And still, I think there's a factor of mental illness, a lack of seeing the world logically that sparked Bowers to commit this mass shooting. But what about the organization that hosts this website, that allows these sorts of conspiracy theories to float around under the perception that people are allowed to host their radical opinions when other websites, other monitored grounds are frequently censoring these views? So to me, this Gab.com, and I don't even want to really do any reconnaissance to understand completely what some of these internet goers are saying, I can maybe partially acknowledge their intent to give people freedom, but it's to the wrong crowd. Definitely the people, and I'll put that in quotation marks, the people who can't civilly discuss these things without holding rampant bias, sheltering themselves from reality, and unable to process anything other than the exciting, extreme, out there viewpoints of things. I believe at least that this website has rules and infrequent moderation at times to uphold some guidelines like no actual threats of violence. The heads of Gab.com came out and said they wouldn't condone anything of the sort. But at the same time, this domain is having difficulty staying up now that it's been found that one of their members had been behind this act. Since, of course, no one really wants to fund this place to keep it alive, it needs independent donors. People I'd guess to be mostly conservative, willing to contribute and maintain this platform for themselves, where there has to be a place on the internet somewhere for these views. It gets to be such a blurred line sometimes when it comes to free speech these days, though. Is it just like a view that's biased, or is it dangerous? You never know who's saying it. And while I'd like to think that people in my generation are aware, hopefully, just that free speech isn't a protective blanket to throw over yourself and hide under when your views are dangerous and you think you can keep saying them. Responsible use of free speech is getting more difficult to teach when even the older generations, with a firm, polarized stance in their mind, find the ease and sort of the utility that you can get away with your words a little easier if you say them online. Especially in the presence of like-minded people, which is what we get in Gab.com's case, or in an individual, completely isolated circumstance with Sayaka, Who are you talking to when it comes to your virtual media posts? The answer to that question matters a lot. I think instead of me suggesting better policing or prosecution over these affairs for the future, I also might not be the first to point out that this incident took place in the Pittsburgh neighborhood where Mr. Rogers, one of the best-known children's educators, lived for a time. Fred Rogers was a Presbyterian minister, but his knowledge about spirituality is read to extend to Buddhism, Catholicism, and Judaism. The message I'm sure Mr. Rogers would have wanted to say to everyone if he were still alive today was to still love your neighbor, believe in the human spirit, and generally think about how it feels to be a child growing up in this time period. We're supposed to be making the safest, best possible world for our younger generations, and I personally suppose the way that'd be taught is tolerance, friendliness, understanding. I think we definitely need a role model for kids on public television these days, like Mr. Rogers again. But let's transition away to some more music here on WVYC. This will be from a band named Local Natives, a song called Black Balloons. You're listening to the voice of your college on 88.1 FM. Welcome back to 88.1 FM WVYC. That was Local Natives with Black Balloons here on WVYC. Before I launch into my next topic, I want to read the public service announcement of the hour since it's about 3:25 or so. And so, moving on, I want to go into a little bit of news across the ocean to the United Kingdom, where my following of British soccer made me aware of a couple notable stories. Starting with something at least partially American, the NFL has really been stepping it up with games that take place across the pond. The game between the Philadelphia Eagles and the Jacksonville Jaguars began early on Sunday morning in Wembley Stadium. That's the big one situated in London. They had 85,000 fans during this particular game. Philly hung on and got a 24-18 win out of it. It was the last game to be played in the UK this season, I believe. And for this team that's supposed to be based out of Jacksonville, the fact that the Jaguars have been playing at least a game a season in this stadium ever since 2013 and are going to keep doing it until 2020, they could very well be based in London at this rate someday, or not. But in a way, I guess it's kind of interesting to me that this Florida-based team has been sort of adopted by a bunch of Londoners. But I agree that it takes a lot of hassle and coordination in order to pull something like this off. Well, first of all, the sleep schedules of the players and the staff. It's only maybe a 5-hour difference, but on the East Coast where most people watch the Eagles and the Jaguars, the game started just when the Americans were waking up. It would have been such a pain for a team or fans on the West Coast, for instance. But why go through so much trouble to get these teams out of the country? It's probably a huge success in the grand scheme of things if you account for the 3 games this year in London. And they're actually doing a game between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Los Angeles Rams in Mexico City on a Monday, November 19th. This is basically a great opportunity to make international fans of the sport. And basically the ulterior motive of it is you can sell tickets and player jerseys to other countries this way. We strictly think of the NFL as America's game, but for the longevity of the sport, I feel these marketing heads want to have a go at other populations, other cultures, to see if this activity of guys colliding with each other is what other people want to watch, basically. Soccer's had this ability to permeate to every corner of the globe, and while I can't say why it has for sure, is it the accessibility to play, the sportsmanship, the skill, it also might take a fair bit of magic for the NFL to catch on elsewhere. And I don't really know what the NFL executives are betting on with international appeal, but it gets the team from Jacksonville to Wembley Stadium. But the planning in this particular game between the Eagles and the Jaguars last Sunday was a mess from what happened afterwards. So virtually every NFL team these days does not have real turf anymore. It gets torn up and it's expensive to maintain, I guess, yet baseball stadiums seem to do it fine. But anyway, Wembley Stadium is for soccer matches. It's where some championship games are played in England, and for instance, this is where a team called Tottenham Hotspur are playing their matches throughout the Premier League soccer season because a new stadium for themselves is being built. They had to share space with the NFL the 3 times they came to town this year already, and I think before like typically got their games in on a Saturday like every other British soccer team does. But there must have been something that TV executives or Premier League executives must have gotten in their heads when they were assuming this would work well, because it didn't. Because when they played this match between Tottenham Hotspur and defending champions Manchester City on a Monday after NFL Sunday, I guess to try to create like Monday Night Football in Britain or something. Like the point where I'm trying to get to this is like what they were supposed to do with the yardage lines and the out of bounds lines and the big NFL shield logo they painted in the center of this real turf. Because like when I tuned into the soccer match, here they were all working around these two different types of field in one. And from having more than 24 players in studded sneakers walking around on this grass for upwards of 3 hours just a day before, it made this normally pristine field a mess. Like, just like with baseball, groundskeeping with soccer is basically an art form, and the way they mow and trim it, paint the lines, design like grids and curves in the turf just from the density of the grass. They even raise out sprinklers and water the field before the game and during halftime. It's a lot of work. But the NFL game just shredded the state of the ground. I've never seen dirt in the 4 years I've been watching soccer of any form. And then there's these gashes on either sideline, an even wider continuous one through the whole middle of the field from one end to the other. And then you have the faded numbers every 10 yards, the NFL logo that I mentioned also sort of fading away. I felt offended on behalf of all the British people who like tuned in to see this matchup, because the presentation of the whole turf, it even affected the game too. Like Tottenham were losing by a goal, but right before the final whistle, one of their players had a pass coming to his feet really quickly and had acres of space to shoot it right away, give it a slap shot with his foot, and it just rocketed up into the stands instead. And the instant replay showed the ball sliding through this patch of grass on one side, actually skipping up and bouncing in the dirt a little as it crossed over to the other side. And by the time it hit this player's foot, the difference in inches was just enough that he couldn't get the angle right on it, and that cost this team the game essentially. Now, the first goal of the match was within minutes of the starting whistle, and that was from a Manchester City player by the name of Riyad Mahrez. He's an Algerian. After he scored, he pointed with his hands skyward as his teammates surrounded him to congratulate him. But this gesture, as one commentator suggested, might have been on behalf of someone Mahrez knew who had passed away just 2 days ago on Saturday. That was the owner or the chairman of Mahrez's former team, the Leicester City Foxes. Now, if you didn't hear any portion of the news coming across the Atlantic to hear, there was a tragedy in the world of soccer that claimed the life of the 61-year-old team president, Vichai Srivaddhanaprabha. He was a billionaire in Thailand and was worth about $3.8 billion, owner of the King Power International Group. I hadn't really heard of it either until I saw it show up on the jerseys of Leicester City players. But what happened was a fiery helicopter crash last Saturday, just after Mr. Vichai finished watching his team tie with an opponent from the stands. When all the fans had cleared, the commentators and the critics and the pundits were just settling in with their post-game notes, this personal helicopter of his flew into the center of the field to take him and a pair of his staff members back home to his estate in London. And the scary thing about it is they televised the helicopter taking off. Like, some British men were in a booth talking about the results, and through the window in the booth they went, "Oh, there's the Leicester City owner going up in his heli." And 40 seconds later, after the copter left the ground and got above the stadium, unbeknownst to many people, the vehicle started spinning around uncontrollably in the air. And it crashed into the, fortunately, empty parking lot. And just the flames that eyewitnesses filmed, you could tell that no one got out of that wreck alive. And with the loss of Mr. Vichai, his two most trusted staff, and the pilot with his co-pilot girlfriend, that makes 5 lives in total lost all of a sudden on what was supposed to be a typical Saturday. What made him more important than just a foreign owner who had all the money and lived a lavish lifestyle? He turned this particular Leicester City soccer team around when he bought it in 2010. He cleared the team's debts, and in 2014 he earned Leicester a promotion to the Major League, this Premier League, where only 20 teams are allowed to play in a season. It's kind of like raising the York Revolution AAA baseball team here into the MLB. Now, they almost got kicked back into the lower leagues next year with one of the worst records in England, but before the season ended, they did so well at the end they manufactured what's called the Great Escape, and barely ensured they could avoid relegation, this kicking out back to the minor leagues. But 2015 to 2016, my freshman year, this low-end team owned by Mr. Vikai appointed a coach that turned Leicester into Premier League championship winners. It was the biggest turnaround success maybe ever recorded in soccer history. They took 5,000 to 1 odds of winning first place and did it anyway. That was Mr. Vikai's role in all of that. His basically investment into the city to write a Cinderella story for the whole population. And still, he was apparently very humble. He liked to buy fans at the stadium free drinks, never appeared in front of TV cameras, so I can't even tell you how he spoke. But now this team has to move forward without its father figure, basically. Leicester City plays tomorrow, just a week after losing their chairman, and I hope they can get a win for Mr. Vikai. And it would be even more stellar if they could have a great season for his sake, but at this point, the superstar status of so many of the players that were part of that incredible season, like Riyad Mahrez, the goal scorer on Monday, they've been bought away to different teams. Compositionally, they're not the same, but it'd be awesome if they could fire up that same spirit that won them a surprise championship. I'm going to move on to a new topic in just a little bit here on WVYC, and heading back into America to break down what in the world almost happened to the Robert Mueller probe. We've got a quick commercial break from the station coming up, though, and I will be right back on WVYC.
They'll challenge your authority, because that's what kids do. But this car is your territory, and in here, your word is law. So when you say you won't move until everyone's buckled up, you won't budge an inch until you hear that click. Never give up until they buckle up. A message from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council. For more information, visit safercar.gov/kidsbuckleup.
Who are you? I'm no one.
Well, not to us here at WVYC, the voice of your college. Everyone is welcome to join us on air at 88.1 FM and online at WVYC.radio or at TuneIn.com, or download the TuneIn app for Apple or Android devices.
Welcome back. My name is Keelan Tollinger, and you're with me on WVYC. And about 3:36, a couple more topics to get into, so I'm going to go right ahead into breaking down this whole story about potential sexual harassment claims against Robert Mueller for you, the best that I could do. So, at the beginning of the week, a spokesperson for the probe announced that they learned of allegations that several women were offered compensation if they could make false claims about the special counsel. And now there's an investigation underway through the FBI to get to the bottom of it. The story goes so far that one woman on the 22nd of October received an email from Surefire Intelligence, a firm that only came together about 3 weeks ago, according to this article by The Atlantic, and basically was a message asking this woman to download a secure communications app called Signal on her smartphone, where she was supposed to talk about all the encounters she had with Mueller. Around the same time, another woman got a similar message to download Signal, prepared to talk about Mueller, but even was offered to be paid off all her credit card debt, and then $20,000 on top of that, as long as she made accusations of sexual and workplace harassment, and signed an affidavit about it. And this is totally crazy enough that someone would be motivated to pay women for false claims, but this Surefire Intelligence Agency hardly seems to have covered its tracks. And when the second woman asked who this anonymous emailer was working for, it was a man in Washington named Jack Berkman, a conservative lobbyist and radio host, and the Surefire Intelligence Agency website is apparently owned by a man named Jacob Wohl. And of course, they're both known for being pro-Trump conspiracy theorists, I guess without the red caps or the tinfoil hats. And evidently, both of these two started hinting on social media that there's a huge scandal waiting to drop like a bomb on Robert Mueller later in the week. This was beginning on Tuesday. And we're going to hold a press conference about the whole scandal at a Washington, D.C. hotel yesterday. But it seems like the intelligence community knows full well these accusations are fake, and these two men in question are the cause of it. At this press conference at noon yesterday, both Berkman and Wohl showed up, but without the woman they said that was prepared to come forward about this incident in a New York hotel room in August 2010. She apparently booked a flight somewhere else, of course. They took turns denying any knowledge of bribery, anything illegal or unethical about this whole private investigation that they made. And when asked by a reporter if they're both ready for federal prison, Berkman responded that no, they are not. And let's see, one thing that kind of stood out to me about this whole story is this Jacob Wohl guy is only 20. Like, he's younger than me. And yet he's part of this newly established firm that I can only say is this, like, young, spirited motivation to make a big splash before Election Day. He tweeted this photograph of his hair, like, combed, standing in some hallway with this awkward face looking down at his phone, and simply called the caption of it, "Big Day." It feels diluted to me, like, bad enough that these guys got the attention of the media enough to generate a suggestion the Mueller probe might be totally a mistake. But, like, the investigation is apparently concluded, I thought I read too, and they're just withholding the results until after Election Day. And I'm still not really convinced that, you might have heard on my first Trump checkup of the semester that the whole lengthy period to come up with some evidence connecting our president to the Russians, I think that's going to come up empty. Because whatever social media messages these government agents made and the election hacking they tried to commit, I don't think it would be possible to find a sign that Trump gave the okay to all that and have it be remaining hidden for this long, if that makes sense. Like, if news media could get to the bottom of this whole conspiracy theory in a day of the special counsel acknowledging this investigation into these claims, I think we would have known something about the Russians by now. And this whole issue is just about, like, the weaponization of sexual assault claims instead. It's stooping so very low to just discredit someone under any way possible. And part of me just wonders if a woman this agency approached would have signed on. And no, I wouldn't expect it to, like, hold for long when email and phone records start to tie the motivations together. But any sort of claim about willy-nilly accusations thrown about is just as damaging to the real cases of assault survivors. Like, just as much as the case with Judge Kavanaugh. In both circumstances, we have claims that just amounted to nothing. There needs to be, like, more severity, careful scrutiny, no reasons whatsoever for any accuser to falsify something. It's reports of incidents that need to show up outside of conspiracy theories and bias that'll transform the climate of this Me Too era, I guess is what I'm saying. And perhaps more of this story amounts later on in the weeks ahead, hopefully with nothing but just punishment for the two men behind this, but we'll have to see. I think it's about time for another weather check here at about 3:40, so currently at your College of Pennsylvania. And I'm about to dive into some more music here on WVYC, and I think maybe, though, that Halloween has passed and all, it might be time for some, like, spooky music that's also fun to hear, not the Monster Mash, for sure. I think some students earlier in the week, around Monday, planned to do a show on WVYC about, like, reading from the work of Edgar Allan Poe, like the king of short horror stories. There's a couple of his works that I enjoy, like The Cask of Amontillado, that we've read millions of times during high school, and maybe revisiting his poetry here and there is a good diversion, but particularly, there's this song that the work of Edgar Allan Poe's work inspired. It's from the Alan Parsons Project in an album called Tales of Mystery and Imagination. The Raven is a neat piece of progressive rock, and it's coming up next on 88.1 FM. My name is Keelan Tollinger, and I will be right back. Welcome back to 88.1 FM, WVYC, the voice of your college. That was from the Alan Parsons Project, The Raven, from Tales of Mystery and Imagination. Pretty nice song. So I'm going to throw in a quick tangent here about a topic of debate recently on municipal internet service providers. So we know about, like, big data companies like Comcast with Xfinity and AT&T, maybe Verizon, those groups that, like, commonly provide internet connectivity for communities. You pay their set price, They give you a rate of data transfer. You get to use their services, kind of like paying the power company to give you your lights. What if, for instance, a city built its own internet network for its citizens? Would it help the wallets and cut into the sales of these big data companies? And an article earlier this week featured the claims of a Republican commissioner named Michael O'Reilly in the FCC. Remarks from a speech he made at the Media Institute's Free Speech America event. And first, he criticized the expansion of municipal-run internet networks that Obama's administration promoted. And then he focused on the potential limits of free speech that these cities put on their citizens, their customers. And to quote him, municipalities have been notorious for their use of free speech codes in the terms of service of state-owned networks, prohibiting users from transmitting content that falls into amorphous categories like hateful or threatening. These content-based restrictions implicated like protected categories of free speech would never pass muster under strict scrutiny. In addition to conditioning network use upon waive of the user's First Amendment rights, these terms are practically impossible to interpret objectively and are inherently up to a bureaucrat's discretion. How frightening. So basically what O'Reilly is saying is that in order to use these city-run internet networks, you give away your free speech rights. They can censor you at will, cut off your service if you aren't following their terms. But the irony of this, actually, is that the big companies like AT&T and Comcast have exactly the same prohibiting language on speech that's obscene, indecent, hateful, malicious, racist. Like, this is from AT&T's terms of service that I'm pulling from. They too can cut off your service if they catch you abusing your free speech, just like these cities can do. And it feels like the FCC commissioner here is throwing blame out only at the local level, while the corporations are escaping all of it. And with the way this current FCC board is Republican controlled under Trump, and it recently voted to repeal the notion of net neutrality, a topic that I'll save for another day, but it's just as important. But it's like this war over whether or not a municipality can build its own network and not have to use a big corporation's property is kind of a shame, I guess. And to put things into perspective here on the campus, your college has its own miniature network with its own bandwidth, like an internet web that you have to be logged into to use. And not surprisingly, it too has its own rules to monitor each and every student's and staff member's browsing habits. You download a program to your computer in order to go online, and while this allows us access to the whole world here within this tiny campus space without having to pay an existing company, you can imagine the same principle when a city like Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Wilson, North Carolina implement these. And what they do is say no thank you Comcast, no thank you AT&T, we've got this. And they build their own wires and fiber optic networks like telephone cables for all this data. And it takes millions and millions of dollars, which is why it's pretty rare to see around the country. But it pays for itself in time when the city gets to charge its people usually a more reasonable rate than these corporations to go online. That's the utility of it. Even internet as a utility like water, electricity, I think a city should have a right to build. And the big corporations don't like that at all. And here the FCC wants to argue against this trend because of fears of censorship. Which I just said, both municipal governments and data corporations are applying the same rules about hate speech here. I don't know why it's such a big deal. And again, this is only what a FCC commissioner said in a speech to the public, not necessarily proposing cities dig up all the cables they laid out and cut them apart so that Comcast can move in. Just from the standpoint of open access internet to everyone, I feel like townships going ahead should pay attention to this issue and see about coming up with future plans. And I'm going to keep an eye out for stories like this in the future just to see where it goes. But it's an interesting topic to me. Anyway, my hour is just about up here on 88.1 FM, WVYC, and I'll be back in a little bit after another Halloween-related track. Coming up next, it's, yeah, you know what it is. Yeah. I'm sure if I play it, you'll figure it out. It's pretty obvious. I'll return soon. I had to do it. Had to play it. It's a classic. That was Thriller from Michael Jackson, and a pretty classic Halloween song to finish off this hour. But before I sign off for the afternoon here on WVYC, I want to tell everyone that I shaved my facial hair. It's not really an important news story, but I'm sure that hundreds of thousands of other guys are doing it too, just at the beginning of November. I'm participating in No Shave November, or Movember, whichever you want to call it, because the origin of this special month began in Australia, where men's facial hair is sometimes called a mo. Anyway, the whole deal is to just not shave, maybe only trim beards and mustaches in places where you think it's necessary, but overall raise awareness about men's issues such as prostate cancer and suicide. A man's health makes them die 4 years earlier on average than women. For the money you don't spend on razors or shaving cream, it goes instead to charities. Even though I don't try to grow what's on my face out too far, I think I'll give it a shot, just like I quietly did last year, and maybe confuse my family coming home during Thanksgiving break. But I'll be honest, I get facial hair so slowly, and I have to, all my materials are bought in bulk. I typically only spend a dime every 2 months or so to cover the cost of being clean shaven. But I think $15 is a good estimate to give away, and I need to do some more research on which foundations or charities I want to give money to first. The Movember Foundation has apparently raised $837 million since 2006 across 20 countries or something, which is pretty decent. But it's not like you're seeing my face through the radio much to really gauge my progress, so just believe me anyway. Maybe get the word out on the street, whatever you want to do. That closes out my show for this Friday. Please tune in next week for a revisit from Bobby Furta, one of my former co-hosts, and we'll do some catching up and breaking down of whatever recent news we find interesting. Until then, my name is Keelan Tollinger, and I appreciate you spending your afternoon in the studio. Remember that I have a YouTube channel where you can find by searching In the Studio with Keelan Tollinger to catch up on all my covered topics. We will close with Caro Bonito with Time Today. And thank you for listening to 88.1 FM WVYC. Have a good weekend.